In this lesson, you'll learn how to use HSL curves to adjust skin tones. Let's press Shift F to get out of the full screen viewer and select our third shot. This shot should look familiar because it comes from the piece we worked on earlier. Because this is the last lesson on this section on color grading before we move to a new topic, let's use it as an opportunity to review some of the steps we've used so far. We already have 3 nodes in here. I'll select the first 2 by dragging a marquee around them and press Command D to disable them. The first node is a balance node as usual. I'll toggle it off with Command or Control D. I'll also bring up our scopes so we can see that the original shot had very compressed dynamic range. This is because it was a log encoded clip. I added a grade, as we can tell from the icon here and the tooltip that appears, using the primaries wheels, as well as the adjustment bar. I could have applied a LUT if I'd wanted to by right-clicking on the clip and choosing the appropriate LUT. In this case, the camera was a Canon camera shot on Canon log, and you could apply this LUT as the grade or as a start to the grade. I chose to grade this manually. The second node I used to improve the sky. I'll toggle it back on and off. If I toggle it on, you can see I used the qualifier by the red dot here and a power window. The qualifier to select the specific hue, saturation, and luminance range to select the sky. We can see that with Shift H or highlighting. We can see that in black and white as well. And to see the power window, we can select the power window button in the central palette. Or, if we're still on the qualifier, we can click on the tools underneath the viewer and select power window to see the window that I used to contain our qualifier just to the sky and not include anything in the lower half of the shot. Let's turn that window back off. This third node I used to address the headdress color. Here's with it on, and here's with it off. With it off, the headdress is very saturated and doesn't look correct for the scene. I'll turn it back on. Notice in the central palette, there are red dots next to the qualifier, the window, and the tracker, indicating that each of these tools have been used to modify this node. Let's select the window. Here we can see that the curve window type has been used to draw a mask around the headdress. If I scrub through the clip, we can see that the window is tracked to the headdress. Let's select the tracker. Here we can see the track data for each of the pan, tilt, zoom, rotate, and 3D parameters because they're all checked. Therefore, the window rotates in 3D space to track the headdress. By the way, another way you can tell what corrections have been applied to this node is, in addition to the icons on the node, is the tooltip that pops up when you hover the cursor over it. Now, I'll disable this node, and I want you to notice how bright the red part of the headdress is at this particular frame. If I scrub back, notice how much darker it becomes. This change in luminance needs to be accommodated in our qualifier. I'll press Command or Control D to re-enable the node and Shift H to enable the highlight. Now I'll move to a frame where the sun isn't hitting the headdress directly, and I'll adjust my luminance range selection so that I still have a good qualification on this frame. Now, if you had done your qualification on this frame, you might think you had a very good qualification and you'd grade the clip and move on. But if I now scrub forward, you see that we completely lose the selection once the sun hits the headdress. I'll expand that luminance selection back out again. The takeaway here is when you're making qualifications to always check every frame of the clip that you're working on. I'll press Shift H again to turn off the highlight. Great, now let's tackle the skin tones. Let's add a new node with Option or Alt S. Use our assigned keyboard shortcut Tab to rename the node. I'll name it Skin. Now, we could use a qualifier, like we just did for the headdress, to select the skin. Another way to adjust skin tones is to use what are called HSL curves, which employ a softer approach. I'm going to go to my curves, and rather than a custom curve, we're going to start with hue versus hue. Remember, in Resolve 18, just like with all the other palettes, this drop-down menu has been replaced by these icons, and this one is hue versus hue. And before I select this, the way this naming convention works is that the first item is the selection, and the second is the thing we're changing. So for hue versus hue, we're selecting a hue to change a hue. For hue versus sat, we're selecting a hue to change the saturation of that hue, and so on. Let's start with hue versus hue. Let's also enable the histogram overlay so we can see if it's useful in these next several steps. In order to adjust a hue based on a hue, we have to first select a hue. You could use these color swatches down here, but in our case, we want to sample the skin. So I'll find a good representative sample for the skin and click. Doing so adds 3 control points to the graph. The center one identifies the specific hue that I clicked on. The ones on the left and the right limit the selection to the range of hues that it identified. Note in the histogram overlay that the large amount of reddish-brownish pixels are more related to the background than they are to the skin tone. So I can take the center one and I can drag it up or down to make adjustments. I can also move it left or right, but I don't really know what I'm doing yet. I'm going to undo that. I could also adjust that hue by dragging in the hue rotate field, which allows me to move it up and down more precisely, and I'll undo that. So to understand where we're trying to go, we want to first isolate the skin, and then we'll use a scope to figure out what we're trying to target. So I'm going to use a temporary power window of a circle and place it just on the face. And I'll press Shift-H to turn on the highlight so that we only see the face over in our scopes. The scope that I want to use is the vector scope. The vector scope you can think of as the color wheel. You can think of it very much as one of these color wheels. We have the colors around the outside, or hues, as we rotate around: red, magenta, blue, cyan, green, and yellow. And then as we move from the center out, we're increasing saturation. So the vector scope represents saturation and hue. These traces inside the vector scope represent the pixels in the image, and here it's just the face. In the settings pop-up menu, you can adjust the brightness of those traces, the brightness of the vector scope itself, and you can choose to show the skin tone indicator. Let's also enable the 2x zoom so we can see more detail. We just need to remember this is enabled because it will make the vector scope seem to imply that areas of the image are overly saturated. By default, all tonal ranges are included in the vector scope, but you can limit these to just the lows, just the midtones, or just the highlights. Let's keep it at all. Checking the Extents checkbox adds an outline identifying all graphical excursions that may not be visible in the vector scope. I'll click outside the settings window to close it. So you can use the vector scope to evaluate hue and saturation, as opposed to luminance in the RGB parade or in the waveform. Skin tone for all people of all races has a very similar hue or angle on the vector scope that's identified by this line. The reason different skin types have different color is because we have different amounts of saturation and brightness in the same hue. So every skin type of any race should have traces along this line. It's just a matter of how far along the line they should be. So with the vector scope open, let's go back to our curves, and my goal is to move these traces of the skin onto the skin tone line. I'll drag in the hue rotate field until they move onto that line, and we can also see the changes in the viewer. With that done, I can turn off the highlight with Shift-H. So with this curve, I've managed to make the skin tone hue more accurate. I'll turn off that temporary window. To adjust the saturation of the skin, let's add another node. Tab, Skin, Sat. Maybe we'll go back to this first one and name it Skin Hue. To adjust the saturation, we'll use the hue versus sat curve. The hue versus sat curve will adjust the saturation based on a specific hue we select. So once again, I'll sample the skin, and we get our same set of 3 control points. But now changes to the central control point will change saturation instead of hue. Now, the question is, what is the right level of saturation? This is more subjective than hue, but in general, darker skin tones are more about 25% saturation and lighter more towards about 40% saturation. In this case, I'm just going to drag in the saturation value field to pull down the saturation just a little bit. I'll purposely go too far. Notice how, as opposed to the hue versus hue curve, there's absolutely no impact on the histogram overlay here as we adjust saturation, because a histogram is indicating how many pixels exist at each specific hue separate from saturation. They may be less saturated, but they're still the same hue. We're not changing hue whatsoever here. In fact, if we go too far, we can see that not all areas of the skin are being included. We can adjust that by adjusting the range of selected hues by dragging on these outer control points. Notice if you drag off the edge, it comes around to the other side. In that way, we can include more of these skin tones. And then I'll pull back up on that saturation. Just want to drop it a little bit. Let's toggle that off and on. And with it off, let's toggle our original one off and on. We can see a subtle difference, but it's important to get skin tone color correct. The reason for this is skin tone is a memory color. In other words, skin color is something that we all have an expectation for what proper skin color should look like. Memory colors also include things like sky and grass, very common elements that everybody knows and sees very often. Man-made objects, like clothing and cars and trucks and buildings, you have more flexibility in color correcting those because we don't have those as deeply embedded in our psyche. But skin, sky, and grass really have to be correct or they'll pull people out of the story. Next, we're going to pull any color tint that may be in the shadows out of the shadows and add a new node, Option or Alt S, Tab, and I'll call it Skin Luma. And for this, we're going to use the Luma versus Sat curve. In other words, we're going to select a luminance range and adjust the saturation of that range. It's not uncommon to get a color cast in the shadows, and that's what we want to get rid of here. In this case, we don't sample. I know I only want to pull saturation out of the darkest areas of the shot. So I'll click to set a control point right about here, and then pull down the first control point. Doing so removes all saturation from the very darkest parts of the shot, and then ramps that saturation up as we get closer to the midtones. We can toggle that off and on with Command or Control D. And it's subtle, but we can see a little bit of change in the shadow areas, especially in his neck area with his beard. This Luma versus Sat curve is really useful on shots that have areas of different luminance ranges. For instance, an evening shot where you want a colorful sky, but you don't want a colorful foreground. Or a daytime shot where you want the sky to really pop out, but don't want to oversaturate the foreground. There's another curve that is the inverse of Luma versus Sat. Option S for a new node. Tab, I'll just call this Sat versus Luma. It's not necessarily specific to skin correction. None of these are. And then in the pop-up menu here, I'll check this Sat versus Luma. Before I do that, as opposed to Luma versus Sat, which we adjusted here, it will do the opposite. In this case, we reduce the saturation of a darker part of the image. If I go to Sat versus Luma and select this new node, in this case, I can adjust the brightness of a certain level of saturation. If we look at the histogram here, this represents levels of saturation from no saturation to highly saturated. And there's nothing super highly saturated in here. It's mostly down here. So moving this curve over in this side won't have much impact. In fact, if I were to place a lock point here and move this, this will have really no impact on the image at all. There's very little happening over there. But you can get some stray, highly saturated items that you can get rid of. In fact, if we look at the extents in the vector scope, we see that there are small little pixels that are very, very saturated, and we can get rid of those by reducing these brighter parts. So what I'll do is move this point down about here, add another point, bring this down, bring the last point all the way down, and notice how those extents start to pull in as we're getting rid of those stray, super saturated pixels, and we're bringing their brightness down. So we're reducing the brightness of the very saturated pixels and therefore reducing their saturation at the same time. You'll notice in his headdress, the gold band at the top starts to get some artifacts at the front of it because we're making those super saturated bright areas just too dark. So you don't want to go too far with this but it can be a good way to pull out saturation of specific areas of your image, especially in the bright highlights or the darkest shadows. We could do the same thing over here by adding another control point. And by the way, I'll press undo. If you hold the shift key down, it'll stop that line from moving when you add it, and I could darken the least saturated pixels in the image. So very helpful to have the inverse curve available to allow you to adjust the luminance based on specific saturation levels. For a final step, we'll use some skin softening. And I'm not going to add a new node for this. Instead, I'm going to go to Open Effects, down to the Sharpening category, and I'm going to take the Soften and Sharpen effect and drag it to the connection line between the last node and the output, and when I see the plus sign, I'll release the mouse. Doing so creates a Resolve Effects node. This node is different than our other nodes we've been adding so far in that you can't add color corrections to it. In other words, you can't use the grading tools, windows, or qualifiers on this node. It's only for Resolve Effects. Let's go to the full screen with Shift F. Find a good representative frame, and then we can increase the details with the small texture slider. You could decrease the medium texture to soften most of the skin, but in this case, I like to have him pretty rough skin. And even with a large texture, I like how it brings more detail around his eyes. You can also adjust that small texture size, and usually you may use this to do some skin softening, but in this case, because of the gritty nature of the piece, I really want to bring out some of the skin detail. Finally, I may back off some of that adjustment with a global blend, and Shift F to get out of that view. It took a lot of nodes to do all our corrections on this one clip. In the next lesson, we'll move on to part 2 of this tutorial, starting with importing an XML timeline.